Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series. I'm Corinne Edwards, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Educational Supports here at the Michigan Department of Education, or MDE. This series associated with the comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history is the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. It is through this vision that we advance our efforts to provide an assurance of Michigan students having opportunities to learn history from a comprehensive stance. As such, the MDE remains committed to the teaching of history through diverse viewpoints. The MDE encourages teachers to lean into the teaching of rich and diverse history of our country and world. Today's presentation intends to provide educators additional perspectives, knowing that as educators expand their knowledge, they will be better able to create lessons that help students meaningfully engage with history. We're proud to work with institutions of higher education, cultural centers, and the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Departments, bringing their research and expertise directly to Michigan educators. Today, we are fortunate to welcome Dr. Nakia Parker as our presenter for this three-part series, who will share the rich history of civil rights and equal rights. Dr. Parker is an assistant professor of history at Michigan State University. We look forward to hearing and learning from her. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Saylor, Assistant Director in the Office of Educational Supports, to usher us forward into today's session. Dr. Saylor.
Teaching comprehensive history webinars are intended to lift the knowledge of educators so that in turn, you may provide opportunities for students to inquire, think critically, and explore history from multiple perspectives you may have not heard before. As you listen today, you are encouraged to consider how this content and perspective could be incorporated to enhance learning in your community. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Nakia Parker, Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University. Her research and teaching interests include slavery, African American history, and Native American history. She is currently finishing her first book, Trails of Tears, Lives of Bondage, Black Life and the Limits of Kinship in Indian Slave Country, 1830 to 1836. Which examines the lives of people of African descent in the Choctaw and Chickasaw Nations who were enslaved. Dr. Parker's research has been published in several academic and public history mediums, including the Journal of African American History and the New York Times bestseller, 400 Souls, A Community History of African America, 1619 to 2019. Welcome, Dr. Parker.
Thank you, Dr. Saylor, and thank you for this opportunity to chat with everyone for the next 3 weeks, and looking forward to your questions and insights. So I will share my screen here. So the theme of my presentations for the next 3 weeks center on civil rights and equal rights. And normally when we think about these terms, civil rights and equal rights, we generally have a particular time period that we associate those struggles with gaining equal and civil rights. And generally it's the 20th century, post-World War II United States. We think about the civil rights movement, the right to gain equal voting opportunities, to protest against racial discrimination, as well as job discrimination. And of course, that would be correct. But what I would like to do for the next 3 weeks, starting today, is to have us to think about the struggles for these rights on the part of Black Americans in a much broader sense, particularly chronologically. These fights did not just culminate in the 20th century. They were happening centuries before, even as early as the founding of the United States. And so that's what we'll start to talk about today. There are a couple of points that I'd like you to keep in mind as I give my presentation. The first point is this: was hostility to Black Americans concentrated in the Southern slave states? Of course, chattel slavery right? The institution that Black Americans were subjected to, particularly over 4 million Black Americans by the time of the Civil War, which essentially meant people of African descent were considered movable property, chattel. They could be bought, sold, willed, and insured. Was this hostility, this treatment of Black Americans, did that focus in the South? Or was this something that was a national issue? And then another question, a very important question, was freedom synonymous with citizenship at the founding of the Republic? Generally, when we think of civil rights and equal rights, we think about citizenship, particularly when thinking about civil rights, that everyone is entitled to certain rights that the Constitution allows them to be entitled to, like freedom to worship, right? Freedom of speech. Was this the case for Black Americans in the late 18th to 19th centuries? So just to give you a brief overview of what we'll talk about today, first, I'm going to talk a bit about the legacies of Black participation in the American Revolution, particularly when it comes to freedom struggles. And then I'm going to focus on many things about the free Black community in the North, how they were able to achieve emancipation. What organizations and institutions did they create to help with their freedom struggles and to help one another? And then I'll conclude by thinking particularly about that second question. Who is American? That was a question that was a burning issue, particularly in the early 1800s. Where did Black people, particularly free Black people, where did they fit in this idea of American and American citizenship? And then I'll end by talking about the colonization debate. So many Black men fought for the Patriot cause during the American Revolution. Approximately 5,000 Black American men, although some historians believe the number could be as high as 8,000, joined the Patriot cause. It'd be interesting to note that actually more Black men served with the British Army. It was about 15 to 20,000 Black men who served with the British Army and gained their freedom that way, as opposed to those who fought for the Patriot cause. Still, Black participation in the war helped the Patriot cause and helped the colonies to overcome British rule. There's a famous painting that perhaps most, if not all of you, have seen or at least aware of. And it's the picture of Washington crossing the Delaware. And if that could be put in the chat just for people to take a look, that would be great. It's a famous painting now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, really honoring this battle that George Washington fought, a crucial battle in the American Revolution, the Battle of Trenton. It's Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776, surprising the Germans who fought with the British Army, the Hessians, and it was a decisive victory for the United States. But in this painting that's symbolizing this moment, you can see a person in the back, and actually a Black man in the back of the boat crossing with Washington. Now, for years, historians assumed that that person that was being portrayed was someone named Prince Whipple, who fought in the Revolutionary Army. But the painter, who was a German abolitionist named Emanuel Lutz, historians found out later, wasn't necessarily portraying a particular person, but he wanted to show, just in general, that Black people participated in the Revolutionary War. He wanted to symbolize Black participation in general because he was this ardent abolitionist. He also used this painting to inspire German revolutionaries at the time in the 1840s. Germany was undergoing its own revolution, and they looked to the United States for inspiration. And so he created this painting that now hangs in the Met Museum, showing that, again, as far as the Patriot cause was concerned, there were Black people who fought. In addition, George Washington also had a enslaved man named William Lee, and that's another picture that can also be posted in the chat, that accompanied him during the Revolutionary War. He was even beside George Washington during battles. He would sometimes hold his spyglass. He would prepare his horses as well. And he was given freedom because of his service, in part during the Revolutionary War. George Washington wasn't as magnanimous with all of the people that he enslaved, but again, we can see from the example of William Lee that there were people who participated in the war. And these veterans, along with Black women who also gave support to the Patriot cause, whether by sewing clothes, sewing flags, preparing food, these Black veterans and others composed a small but important part of the growing free communities that were in the North. In 1760, the free Black population in the British colonies just consisted of a few thousand people. But by 1790, during the founding of the United States, that population number reached 60,000 and then 110,000 by 1800. And these remarkable increases reflect a number of developments. Many, in fact, thousands had seized their liberty during the war by running away, some from running away from slave states in the South, like South Carolina and Georgia, to places like New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts. Others went the legal route and pursued successful freedom suits. One of the persons who did so was the person that you see to the left, Mum Bet. Her petition for freedom, which was articulated using revolutionary rhetoric, embodies enslaved African people's response to conflict between their enslavers and the mother country, Britain. So Mum Bet was a slave in Sheffield, Massachusetts. There was slavery in the North. Places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island had slavery too. And she was inspired by public discussions of the Declaration of Independence. And she filed a suit that secured her freedom. And if you want to take a look at that suit, again, if that could be put in the chat, I provided a link where you can actually look at that primary source of her, of a freedom suit inspired by Mum Bet. So she had endured years of physical abuse at the hand of her enslaver's wife. And after hearing public discussions of the Declaration of Independence and the Massachusetts State Constitution, she asked a local lawyer to take her case for freedom. And she said this: "I've heard that paper read yesterday that says all men are born equal and that every man has a right to freedom. I'm not a dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom?" She was very pointed in highlighting what she thought of as hypocrisy. If we are talking about all men are created equal, needing liberty, desiring, deserving liberty, what about enslaved people? She won her case. And once free, she changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman as a symbol of her liberty. This happened in 1781. And her case inspired thousands of other freedom suits. In fact, just a few years later, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that slavery was incompatible with the state's new constitution, in no small part to people like Elizabeth Freeman and others who used this rhetoric surrounding the American Revolution to enact their own freedom strategies. Other people, however, were not only inspired by the American Revolution, but also another important rebellion, the Haitian Revolution, the largest, most successful slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere. but they didn't use legal means. They wanted to take matters into their own hands, more militant means to gain freedom. One of these people was named Gabriel. He was enslaved in the city of, right outside the city of Richmond, Virginia. He was a blacksmith, and he also was very familiar with the rhetoric surrounding the American Revolution and also of the Haitian Revolution, of oppressed people overthrowing their oppressors. And it moved him to want to get rid of slavery permanently. And so he enlists his brothers, as well as many other enslaved and free Black people, to actually take over the city of Richmond. But he has a particular plan. So he wants to attack the wealthy white population of Richmond, but spare poorer whites in the city. He really wants to do a multiracial coalition. He felt that if they applied for help, asked for help from poor white people in the city of Richmond, as well as appeal for help from local white anti-slavery advocates. For example, many Quakers and Methodists were opposed to slavery. He felt that this coalition of people could come together and overthrow the institution of slavery. He wanted to carry a flag that said death or liberty, very similar to the sentiments of Patrick Henry, who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And because he was a blacksmith, he had a bit more mobility than enslaved people who just worked on the plantation. And so he took advantage of this mobility by going around Richmond's taverns, revival meetings, even barbecues, and tried to recruit people for his plan. The date that he had picked was August 30th, 1800, and the day before the rebellion was supposed to happen, a strong summer rainstorm came, washed out the bridges and roads to the city. Not only did that put a snag in his plans, but word of his revolt spread, as you can imagine. He was actually betrayed by two enslaved people who revealed the plot to their enslaver. And this enslaver later told James Monroe, who was governor of Virginia at the time. And eventually Gabriel and his main co-conspirators were captured and executed. 6 of them were immediately captured, and then the Virginia militia tracked down the others. So Gabriel's plot failed, but it did make white Virginians fear even more the enslaved people in their midst. Another rebellion plot was uncovered in 1802. And so members of the Virginia General Assembly at one point discussed abolishing slavery altogether. And they talked about negotiating with President Thomas Jefferson to actually free Black people, remove them permanently from the state of Virginia. Remember that point, because when we talk about the colonization debate later on, this point will seem familiar. This did not happen. They did not abolish slavery completely, but Virginia lawmakers made life very much more difficult for enslaved and free Black people. They made sure they secured the state capitol's arsenals, right? Blocking any access to weapons. They instituted nightly police patrols or slave patrols that would jail and whip any person, any enslaved person found walking around the city without a pass. They banned enslaved people from hiring out their time. In other words, if you were someone who had a skill like a blacksmith, like Gabriel, sometimes you could actually hire out your time. Your enslaver would allow you to work for someone else and earn money on your own. That was completely banned. And any type of gathering with enslaved people, even if it was a religious gathering, was banned. In addition, free Black people in Virginia also had their rights and opportunities taken away. And actually, legal freedom, what we call manumission, was nearly impossible in Virginia after Gabriel's rebellion. Virginia lawmakers ruled that free Black people could not get a ship pilot license, which was a profession that many free Black people had participated in before. They told free Black people that they had to register in each town that they lived in. And by 1806, Virginia lawmakers had passed a law that stated if you were a newly freed Black person, you had to leave the state within a year, or you would be re-enslaved. You could petition the courts to get an exemption for this, but those petitions were granted few and far between. And as you can imagine, if you were a free Black person, this presented a dilemma. Because even though you would be happy you were freed, a lot of free Black people still had family that were enslaved. They wanted to stay close to their family. This was the place that they knew. This was their community. So again, we can see the aftermath of Black freedom struggles. Again, we can see what hostility and pushback they faced. So now let's talk about achieving emancipation in the North. I'll discuss the importance of Black organizations to the development of free Black communities in the North. While abolition and gradual legal abolition of slavery or manumission in northern states promised freedom to Black people, that promise wasn't always honored. Free Black people faced high challenges, almost insurmountable challenges in the North. Yet the organizations that they created supported newly freed people in their transition from slavery to freedom. By 1804, all northern states had either abolished slavery outright or they set up laws and programs for gradual manumission. Still wasn't easy to gain freedom though. So, for example, in Indiana Territory, gradual manumission laws required that enslaved people had to labor for 30 years before they were set free. In places like Pennsylvania and New York, sometimes people had to labor until they were 21 or 28. They called it an apprenticeship. So to the point that in the 1820s, there were still thousands of people enslaved in states like New Jersey and New York. In Ohio, there were laws called Black laws or Black codes. I also have a link to a petition from free Black people in Ohio protesting Black codes, if you'd like to put it in the chat. In Ohio, Black people were required to present legal proof of their free status. They had to post a $500 bond that guaranteed their good behavior. And they had to have a white person, a white friend to vouch for them. In some places, the bond went up to $1,000. As you can imagine, an exorbitant amount of money. It's a lot of money today. We can only imagine what that must have been like for free Black people as well. In addition, even if you had gained your freedom and moved to places like Philadelphia and New York, there still was the very real threat of being captured, being accused of being a fugitive slave, and then sent back to slavery, sent to slavery in the South. One of the most famous cases happened in the 1840s and 50s that was made into a movie. The real life story of Solomon Northup made into the movie 12 Years a Slave, where he was a free Black man, lived in New York. He was drugged and then later sold in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, and then had to serve 12 years in Louisiana as a slave until he was freed. So because of this threat, we start to see a lot of anti-slavery organizations being developed. So for example, in Philadelphia, the Quakers found an anti-slavery society in 1784. In 1785, white New Yorkers found the New York Manumission Society. Alexander Hamilton was a part of this anti-slavery society. It was not necessarily safe being a free Black person in a northern state, right? Thinking of that first question, hostility was not just concentrated in the southern states. Because of circumstances like these, free Black people in northern cities formed organizations to support each other. These two men that you see in this slide, Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, were two men who converted to the Methodist faith, were able to purchase their freedom in the early 1780s. They met in Philadelphia and they became lifelong friends. And they founded the city's first Black mutual aid society, the Free African Society, that was founded in 1787. Other places had mutual aid societies as well: Rhode Island, Boston, New York, even Charleston, South Carolina. Many early members of the Black mutual aid societies initially belonged to white churches, but they often ended up establishing their own churches to escape prejudice. So Allen Jones and other free Black people attended St. George's Methodist Church until white church leaders began to segregate the congregants. And after being told that they couldn't kneel with white worshipers, the Black members of St. George's left their church and founded their own church, Mother Bethel, in July 1794. That is a church that is still today. You can visit. You can see a picture here, and you start to see other Black Methodist churches forming, independent Methodist Episcopal denominations after that. I mean, this is really the start of the powerful presence of the Black church when it came to Black freedom struggles for equal and civil rights. Again, I think that's something that we think about is more happening in the 1950s and 60s when we think of the role of the Black church, right? Arguably, the most famous face of civil rights, Martin Luther King. He is a reverend. That has a long history, and I'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. But the Black church being the center of political activism, educational activism, economic activism, that starts in the late 18th, early 19th century. In addition, African American women are integral to the success and survival of Black churches. They would often outnumber their male counterparts in congregations and help to sustain the church. One such person was Jarena Lee, and I do have a link to a picture of her if you'd like to put that in the chat. She was the first woman to preach under the auspices of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She was the child of free Black parents. She was born in New Jersey in 1783, and she was strongly affected when she went to hear Richard Allen preach. And when she heard him, she said, I like what he's saying, but I can do that too. She wanted to preach herself. And at first, Allen said no, right? He was very much, this is what men do. They minister. Women listen. You cannot preach at the Methodist church, right? So almost he's replicating, right, some of the discrimination that him and others like Absalom Jones faced. But Lee persisted. And 8 years after his initial refusal, Allen finally allowed her access to the pulpit after hearing a spontaneous exhortation that she gave during a sermon at Bethel Church. And she eventually traveled all over the United States preaching her gospel of freedom. She even risked her life to go to the South to preach to enslaved people, and also was a member of the abolitionist movement as well. Again, here another slide of Mother Bethel Church today. The right to have education, particularly to have Black children educated, was also a freedom struggle for Black people in the North. Free Black people in the North hoped, like everyone hopes, that education would improve their life chances and the life chances of their children. However, the few public schools that were open in the North before the 1830s did not welcome Black people. So free Black people and white anti-slavery organizations opened schools to educate Black children. The centers of Black schooling in the North were the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and New York City. In Boston, free Black people opened the African School in 1798. In New York, the New York Man and Mission Society established the New York African Free School in 1787. Pennsylvania, not too long after that. However, even though these two groups, right, white anti-slavery organizations and free Black people in the church, particularly parents, they may have joined together, but that didn't mean they always agreed. And a lot of times, white anti-slavery organizations were at odds with Black teachers and parents. And particularly because of what the kind of education that was to be given to students. So Black parents wanted their children to have what we now call the typical liberal art education, right? They wanted them to be able to learn to read, write, do math, science, learn Latin and other foreign languages. Whereas some in white anti-slavery organizations felt that Black children should just learn manual skills. In fact, for example, one member said, let's keep a watchful eye over the teaching and also conduct of Negroes, that was the word used for Black people at the time, who have been liberated. We have to make sure we prevent them from running into immorality or sinking into idleness. Right? So you can see where there would be conflict, right? They're automatically assuming that Black children are going to be idle, that they're going to be immoral, and that working with their hands is what would help them not to be that way. And of course, Black parents are pushing against this. They're also advocating to have Black teachers as well. In fact, one of the early people who joined the abolitionist movement are Black teachers, particularly Black women teachers. So again, these struggles of free Black people are not without conflict, but yet they still are creating these institutions and organizations that are important. Now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about this second question that I posed. Was freedom synonymous with citizenship? I have on this slide an image of a political cartoon that is named or titled Bobolition. It is a take on the word abolition, but in a racist and discriminatory way, as you can probably tell by this image. The word Bobolition was a way of making fun of African-American speech and vernacular. You can tell by the images that what is being made fun of is Black people's, particularly Black men's, ability to vote and their political capacity. In addition to having these racist visual images, right? It looks like people are just having a good time. They're drinking, they're laughing, they're not taking freedom seriously. These are questions that all are raised and connected with citizenship, particularly in the 1810s and 20s. And that's what I'll talk about. In fact, the Naturalization Act of 1790 placed further restrictions on free Black people. That was a law that was passed that instituted residential and also racial requirements for potential American citizens. It stated that any potential citizens had to live in the United States for 2 years and that they had to be, and this is a quote directly, free white persons. So without citizenship rights, free Black people couldn't join the national militia. They couldn't have a job like postmaster or carry federal mail. They couldn't hold elective office in the District of Columbia as well. Many Northern whites perceived free Black people as a social menace and an economic threat. They saw Black communities, Black gatherings, and it made some folks nervous. And in fact, on days that should have been celebrated, like Independence Day, When Black people would celebrate that on July 4th, it often put them at risk of being attacked. A lot of riots and racial violence against Black people happened on July 4th. In fact, it got so bad that in some cities, Black people started celebrating Independence Day on July 5th rather than July 4th. Another event that brings up the question of citizenship is the War of 1812. I think it's an event that we don't talk about as much when we think about other events like the American Revolution and the Civil War. I know I didn't learn as much about it as I would have liked while I was in school, but it's important nonetheless. It happens due to continued hostilities between the United States and Britain. The US is afraid that Britain is instigating attacks of Native American people on US citizens. British people, I should say British ships, are also attacking American sailors and impressing them into service in the British Navy. And just like in the American Revolution, Black people, Black men see their participation in the War of 1812 as an opportunity to be seen as worthy of full citizenship. For example, this image that you see to the right, portraying the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson's battle that he's particularly known for, a decisive victory in the War of 1812, even though a truce had already been signed, but largely recognizes the battle that helped in part propel Andrew Jackson to the presidency. Free Black men, hundreds of them, fought in this battle on the side of the United States, something that's not obvious, of course, not even seen in the image. We can see the erasure of Black participation, but nevertheless, they also fought. So again, the outcome of this war, more like a stalemate, right? Nobody gains or loses land. The British don't agree to stop impressment, but many Americans view the War of 1812 as a great victory because after it's over, after 1815, the Americans and British never meet again across a battlefield as enemies. And many felt that Britain finally respected the United States as a sovereign power. This event leads to an outpouring of nationalism. And probably the most recognizable kind of nationalism, I would argue, is cultural nationalism. Essentially, what I mean by that is the focus on creating an American identity, distinguishing Americans from British and Europeans. What makes the United States unique? For example, during this time period, there was a desire to create what was considered American literature. People like Washington Irving became a well-known literary figure in the early Republic. And he wrote a series of popular stories, probably ones that we've read as a child or even now, stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. And these stories draw on a uniquely American culture and perspective. He focuses a lot, like in Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, on the Dutch influence in the Hudson Valley, but he also gives commentary on how America is developing a national identity. That's in part what Rip Van Winkle's about, right? Rip Van Winkle falls asleep. He wakes up 100 years later. The world is a different place. He walks into a tavern. There's a picture of King George on the wall. He says, hey, or I should say there's a picture of George Washington on the wall. It's like, who is this person? And he says, hail King George, right? And he's ran out of the tavern. It's like, I'm a loyal subject of the king. What's happening? No, this is a new time period, a new republic. Irving wanted to show how the world was changing, right? How rapidly it was changing. Art is another example of cultural nationalism. The switch from painting European landscapes to things like the Hudson River Art School and the Romantic movement, right? Painting landscapes that are uniquely American. an emphasis on the Greek revival movement in architecture, pillars like you see here in the house pictured in the top left. Right? Greek revival was popular in the United States because ancient Greece was known as a democracy. Again, highlighting the fact, like this is a country based on democracy, not a monarchy like you see in many nations in Europe. Even language was affected. Noah Webster created Webster's dictionary and wanted American spellings. So for example, for the word color, he took out the U, like the British would spell it. Color was no longer spelled C-O-L-O-U-R. It's like a more American spelling would be C-O-L-O-R. These type of sentiments, right? Thinking about what is an American, what kind of identity is formed, and who can be American, shape what I will talk about to wrap up my presentation today, the colonization movement. All this outpouring of nationalism and national identity is defined, we could say simply, by who is not a citizen, as much as or more than who is a citizen. And despite the outpouring of nationalism and thinking about citizenship after the War of 1812, after the War of 1812, Black men, free Black men who previously had the right to vote, now lost that vote. So for example, Connecticut repealed the right of Black men to vote in 1814. New Jersey repeals this right in 1807. Pennsylvania eventually repeals this right in the 1830s. The deep and abiding prejudices that Black people faced in the United States following the Revolution made not only white people, but also many Black people question the likelihood if African Americans would ever be able to fully participate in American society. Could they ever be incorporated into the body politic? So along with these thoughts, along with losing the right to vote, some white people propose the idea of colonization as a solution to this dilemma. What do we do with this growing population of free Black people that are free, but we do not believe can ever be incorporated into the citizenry of the United States? The ideas comes up of colonization or sending free Black people back to Africa. So people in Britain had already started a scheme like this. In fact, in 1787, the colony of Sierra Leone, later the country of Sierra Leone in Africa, is founded by British reformer Granville Sharp to send Black people to. And something similar happens in the United States in 1816. It's called the American Society for Colonizing the Free People of Color of the United States. In short terms, it's called the American Colonization Society. Its membership included many famous people, prominent white clergymen, lawyers, financiers, politicians like Henry Clay, like James Monroe, as well as Abraham Lincoln, were supporters of colonization. And this organization was founded to earn government support to resettle free Black people in Africa. By 1819, this colonization society had won the support of President James Monroe. They had earned a congressional appropriation of $100,000 for this cause. And the American Colonization Society used this money to establish the colony, now the country known as Liberia. The capital of Liberia was called Monrovia. That was named after President James Monroe. And so the Colonization Society sought to recruit potential migrants. There were hundreds of free Black people who did go. They thought perhaps when they looked at the circumstances in the United States that perhaps they would be better off in a colony just populated with free Black people. And so there were a few hundred, some historians think it might have been up to 1,000 or more who went. But for the majority of free Black people, they did not participate in colonization. In fact, they were very suspicious of the program. Also, I provided a link, if that could be put into the chat, of an 1817 petition called Sentiments of People of Color, and they're protesting colonization. And one of the main reasons that they're protesting colonization is that there's like, this is our land, this is our country, whether we're recognized or not. Many of us were born here, we were raised here. It is our labor that helped found this country. It is our blood, sweat, and tears that have helped created this country. We are not going anywhere. And for next week, I'm going to talk about how this pushback, how this suspicion of colonization really lays the seed, the foundation for a more militant form of abolitionism. The abolition movement that we know today is galvanized by protesting against the idea of colonization. So I'll stop there and thank you for your time and for listening.
Thanks so much, Dr. Parker. We do have a few minutes remaining and we did receive some questions. So if you don't mind, I can share those with you and if you can answer them. And if not, we can follow up via email. So if you want more time to gather resources for folks, we can definitely do that.
Sure.
Okay, the first question says, your presentation helped to explain why there are so many African-American families that have relatives in the southern states that they may never meet, and or the differences in the spelling of the last names and families. Can you say more about this?
Yes, so the migration has always been a huge part of thinking about African American history and the diaspora. Yeah, and particularly thinking about like free Black people having to leave the South and then go north did cause a lot of separation for people who did decide to leave their families and communities. There were some times that they never saw them again. And this just didn't happen to free Black people. When the United States closes the transatlantic slave trade in 1808, that opens the door for the domestic slave trade for enslaved people from the South, Upper South, to be sold to places in the Deep South. And what we do know is that families were often separated. Historians used to think that babies were not separated from their mothers on the auction block. We now know that that's not true. There were some babies only a few days old who were sold from their families. So to the point that when the Civil War ends and Black people start to reconstitute their families, one of the first things that Black people do is they put ads in the paper to find their family members because of this real specter of separation, either from the domestic slave trade, being stolen from your family if you were a free person, or having to leave your family. I'm going to talk more about that in the last presentation. I will go into detail about that, how they went to finding their families, but thank you for that point. Yes, absolutely. Sadly, forced migration, forced separation is a common theme when we talk about Black American history.
Well, thanks for answering. Yeah, thanks for answering the question that did come in from one of the folks who are on with us today. And then we'll look forward to learning more you said the third session, correct?
Yes.
Okay. We have another one, little bit more general question, but what reading would you suggest for middle schoolers to support this history?
Oh, that's a good idea. So in the the sources that I sent, there is a book by historian Erica Armstrong Dunbar, who wrote a book called Never Caught, which was about the enslaved woman of George Washington, who fled when he was serving in the White House, who ran away and avoided them, like evaded recapture for about 20 years and finally gained her freedom. George Washington was even putting runaway slave ads to find her. And there is a young adult edition of that book that I would highly recommend for middle schoolers, because not only does it talk about how enslaved women enacted freedom strategies, but also talks in a very good way about the formation of the new republic. How do we reconcile George Washington being a founding father with him being a slaveholder, and all done in a way that is geared toward 11 to, I believe, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds. So I would highly recommend that book.
Great. And I know you did share with us, on the team, your list of references, so we can make sure that folks who are on the call, we can send that out to everyone. And we were posting as you went along and indicated there were some of those links that we put in, but we can follow up and maybe just highlight that one for middle schoolers.
Great. And I'll think of some more and then put it in the links, Dr. Saylor, so that, you can have more sources.
Sounds great. Okay. So we can send all that out at once to everybody. Thank you. And I think we might have time for one more question. And this one says, you shared a lot of primary sources that included artwork and portraits. Can you share more about the history of the artist or the context of the portraits?
Yeah, so I'll talk a bit about Emanuel Lutz, who was the German abolitionist. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this next week too, when I talk about abolition. The abolition movement, particularly in the 1830s, had a lot of different strategies to appeal to the public. One of those was art, right? It's a visual, it gives you a visceral reaction. And abolitionist art was a powerful strategy that was used to convince people that slavery was a moral wrong. And so Emanuel Lutz's painting is a bit different because he's actually portraying an actual event, right? An actual event, George Washington crossing the Delaware, and showing Black people in a dignified way, right? If you look at the image of the Black man, right, he's dressed up like a soldier, he's very dignified. A lot of abolitionist art did just the opposite. For example, they would show people in tattered clothing on the auction block, or they would show Black people toiling on a plantation. So the types of images varied, but all of them work to actually impress upon people's minds visually how horrible and the moral sin that slavery was, because that's what abolitionists were really going for. Slavery is a moral sin. It needs to be abolished immediately. I'll talk a bit more about that next week.
Well, thank you. And thanks for giving us a little preview of what we'll see next week and the following week. I did just repost the Emanuel Lutz link that you shared earlier. So in case folks didn't get in earlier, they can look at the painting that you were just referencing.
Great.
So I think with that, we thank you so much, Dr. Parker, for sharing your knowledge with us this evening. Your work is so important to Michigan's educators and leaders as it provides support for teaching comprehensive history within our classroom. So we really appreciate you expanding our understanding from a historical perspective, and we really look forward to having you back next week.